This session is dedicated to discussing the outcomes and methodology of the Global Knowledge Index sectors perspectives. We are honored by the Coordinators Committee concerned with the Global Index indicators with a group of international experts. This session is divided into two parts. Part one will discuss the approach of the most important global knowledge index outcomes in the education and higher education and technology sectors. This index was launched in the UN at Expo, and it was symbolic, and it was officially launched, but the methodology was not discussed, nor the outcomes were discussed. We are honored in this session to be joined by Dr. Najwa Gharis, Associate Professor in Tunis University, Dr. Yusuf Sadek, Professor Muhammad the Fifth University, and Dr. Ali Ibrahim, Associate Professor. We start with making the arrangement of the indicator. We have the most important outcomes. We'll start with Dr. Najwa. Peace be upon you, everyone. So, as Dr. Hani mentioned, I will briefly introduce the most important developments of the pre-university index and the international and Arab efforts taken in this area. So we'll remind you quickly of the methodology and the fundamentals on which this index is based. Uh, so the pre-university education index has its legislations based on previous works that were done at the level of the Arab knowledge reports, and it revealed that there is a need for new standards that enables the measurement and monitoring of the changes that take place at the level of education. The main idea on which the index is based is connecting the commitment and of knowledge and development that focus is basically on the human, because as we know, human beings are the makers of development and knowledge. What's new in this index is that it tried to just measure the learning outcomes by highlighting the factors of the, because there are a lot of indexes regionally and internationally that focus mainly on the outcomes. What are the outcomes in science, math, reading? But in order to understand the reality in the correct way, and especially in order to be able to develop, and there was a need to study these outcomes in the light of the environmental factors that are considered as enablers of these outcomes. Hence, the index has been taken as a main tool for development. So the objective is not the figures or the numbers that we would come out with, but it is how to change these numbers into an important information that contribute to building and developing development strategies. Of course, at the methodological level, we have followed all specifications and standards that are known internationally, and we resort to credible international sources, and we work with high confidence in order to compare and arrange. Likewise, we have in general worked on communication or ongoing communication with Arab and international entities. At every stage, we would discuss with those who were working on such experiences before us in order to make sure that we are on track and in order not to repeat ourselves and to reuse what is already in place. Behind the scenes of this index, there was a technical team, a whole technical team of professionals, and this applies not only to pre-university sector but all other government sectors. So there was a technical team supporting us who was closely following up on us and to verify all the statistics and all information in order to reach our outcome with high standards of credibility and trust. 4 years after using this index in its first form, that it started with an Arab index and then it's changed into an international index, and as was mentioned in the first session, the index was revisited and relooked, and we know that this is something common because there are factors and circumstances that take place, and we need to guarantee the continuity of this index. As Dr. Hani mentioned in the morning, there are data that disappear and data that appear and emerge, so we want to make sure that we are keeping abreast of what is going on in order to make sure the index aligns with the international standards. The pre-university index has not witnessed radical changes. As Dr. Hani again mentioned this morning, there was a whole team of consultants and advisors from international organizations who participated in revisiting and reviewing this index, and there was an effort to make sure that this is feasible and the study is ongoing. So the composition of this index was made of two main pillars, which is the knowledge capital. It is everything related to inputs and outputs, or inputs and outcomes of knowledge with the learning environment, taking into account all circumstances that might interfere in this process and that might have impacts on the learning outcomes. Likewise, for the sub goals, the knowledge capitals have not changed, and it is made up of joining, completion, and core. Why do we have these three main pillars? Because it's important that we have a considerable percentage of joiners. Opening schools for those school age people is important, but this is not enough. We should have a tendency to make sure that those who enter school should complete their education, and it is not important. It's not enough to do this, but we should guarantee that we have learning outcomes. We realize that now we have learning loss even among those who finish all these education stages and have certificates. So many people finish their studies, but basically and fundamentally, when they take some international tests, we find out that they don't have the minimum knowledge required to pass those tests. So we realized that these components were essential. As for the enablement environment, we were ambitious to take care of several factors, but unfortunately, this is the dilemma of index and indicators. The loss of data restricted us to focus on 4 points: expenses, learning loss, pedagogical factors, early learning, and we added something new. So the new thing in this index that hasn't been there before is fairness and inclusiveness, and this is in line with the UNSDP SDG's goal in education, which is not to leave anybody behind, not to leave anybody lagging behind in the education. So, fairness and inclusiveness is of paramount importance. This is to guarantee that everyone has the right to education and gain the skills needed and to get the learning outcomes that would help them to be adaptable economically and socially.
According to us, what has changed is expenditure and inclusiveness. We have added other changes which were not there. These are the topics in details, as I mentioned, why we chose them. Now we experience some of the most important outcomes. Internationally, we have noticed that Poland is #1 rank. What is important to us, the Arab countries, we find only the UAE, which has the 6th rank internationally. This is a big advancement and development that the UAE gained in the session of the cycle of the indicator. The other Arab countries, I will concentrate them later. What is important to us to be away from the statistics and the figures? We notice that this indicator has unleashed clearly that there is a big gap between the countries or among the countries that are considered with suitable conditions and circumstances for education in terms of knowledge infrastructure, and the other countries. There is a big gap between these countries. This is indicator that there is an entry to improve the educational outcomes and infrastructure and knowledge and enabling infrastructure. This can be seen in the rest of the Arab countries. According to the other Arab countries, as we know, the UAE is the first, Qatar is the #2, Oman is #3, Saudi Arabia is #4, and so on. And Saudi Arabia has achieved a big leap in this regard. Although this is not comparison, because there is a big change in the variables. Kuwait, Bahrain, Egypt also. We notice that these countries have gone beyond the international median. So these countries have gone beyond the international median, while we find at the end of the list Sudan, Mauritania, and Yemen, and they are below the intermediate level. If we go profound, if we have time, we can fathom these numbers to see where is the disruption that led to this total value. Quickly, if we shed light on the outcomes according to their components, we notice here that if we compare the outcome in the educational environment and the knowledge capital, we notice that there are countries approached in terms of outcomes between environment and capital. This means that it achieved a bit of competence. That means its environment and infrastructure allowed it to get a good approach and a good outcome of what has been presented from good environment, good conditions. In other countries, there is a low competence level, and what environments they do does not transform to an outcome that we can say that it achieved a good degree of balance. We notice that there are gaps differ from one country to another. There are also points of approach. If we see Saudi Arabia, the gap is very narrow between these two topics, and this resembles the international median. We also notice that the level of the gap, like for example, educational capital, is far beyond what has been achieved in the level of the outcomes or the capital. Also, when we compare the level of the outcomes with the people who attend school or who complete their educational cycles and who get good outcomes. There is big gap. The green light, the green sign or the green color represents the gaps. There are a big number of students who attend schools and less complete and less get gains. This is assured by the IMF report about education. We talk about the poverty of education, about people who are still in the education desk, but they do not get the right education. This is another indicator of affliction and poverty also, and education as well. When we transform this gap into indicator of competency, we see that the average of people who attend and the outcomes, we see that the outcomes are, the gaps are very big. Competence is there if we achieve number one. But we notice that some countries like Bahrain reached 0.9 and 0.3, some countries like Yemen and others. This is indicator that there is work must be done to retain students in the schools and retaining with getting knowledge or gaining knowledge. Also, when we compare the indicators of educational environment, first of all, the steps that we see at the beginning or in the front of the row, this does not mean the absence of knowledge. This is important indicator that the information or the data regarding the inclusiveness or expenditure are still rare in most countries. We don't know the level is low or weak. In the rest of the seats, we have indicators. There are countries reached and achieved a good level of expenditure, and other countries are still at the bottom of the baseline. So, according to us, this is a glimpse and an overview about the indicator, that it has many variables, and if they need to be studied profoundly in the reasons of their weakness or strength, many analysis can be made rather than what I have mentioned quickly, and to remain. The problem of indicators, according to us, as mentioned in this morning, the data is there. We have database. Unfortunately, there is no dealing with these indicators by some countries, and we as a team supervise this indicator. We have many challenges. We find the data that allow us to activate the indicator. We are able to apply the statistics, the strong statistics that support methodologically and scientifically or academically these indicators. And the other countries who would like to benefit from these changes or variables should be able to materialize and achieve and transform these numbers into ideas and into then policy or strategy and entry for reform eventually. And there is a fourth challenge. We as Arab countries, because we have common interests in education, how can we create conduits, cooperation conduits, to make us able to invest these data, either afforded by the international indicator or other indicators, to achieve and extract what enforces the benefit of development and improvement. Thank you for listening.
شكرا دكتور.
Thank you, Dr. Najwa, for this presentation. We will take the questions after the end of the presentations completely. We will start with Dr. Yusuf Siddiq to present the methodology of the technological indicator. Thank you for your attendance. I am honored to present this cooperative cooperation of the experts from the Arab countries, basically with the consultation of international sectors about the sectors of knowledge indicator. According to me, I supervised the technological and vocational training sector and what challenges that this sector has in certain conditions that witness the economical transformation and education transformation to bridge the gap between these at the level of life and the level of capital, human capital. These transformations are difficult to amalgamate them in one indicator because indicator is this thing I think has reached the level, a big level, for the target of other countries that enable to involve in the infrastructure of the international transformations. Of course, we do not work away from these indicators that are presented by the other educational institutions and the MRF or UNESCO, MIRF or UNESCO. The vocational training and educational indicator gathers and combines empowerment and with putting them in a framework to present the skills and competencies for the work market or the labor market. And it is difficult in some countries and with difficult outcomes also. According to the vocational and educational indicator, there are several phases. The most important is the first one, to look at all international indicators, and through this phase, the supervisor started to present initial perception and to communicate with other international indicators as a preliminary for discussion with other international experts. The second phase comes of discussion, of course, more discussion with all experts and organizations like UNESCO and MIRF. IMF, all these institutions need to regulate these variables and these changes. And we reached the first phase, which we enabled to prepare an envision or participate.
So there are countries that were capable of enabling its infrastructure, while other countries have relied only on changing the curricula. So in order to create a kind of balance. The most important points raised here for this discussion, it was a rich discussion. From this perspective, I would like to thank all experts from different countries, Malaysia, Germany, and the US, as well as France, who have participated and contributed to enriching this index in its current version. This version has added a lot of things. Why? Because it has been able to communicate and take care of the important things at the level of international indexes. And on top of those are the fairness, enablement, and inclusiveness as human capitals. In addition to qualifications based on the embedment of economy and the vocational training and education. besides, the main problem we are facing today is to digitize vocational training and education. So how can we integrate that into the vocational training and education in order for those students as graduates to be able to communicate with the market, with the labor force, and the skills required for any job? I would like to say that all these inputs have been solidified by the UN SDG. So we are looking forward by choosing some of these changes. We choose them not only because they represent a big number of countries, but it will because it will guide us on to creating a vocational ecosystem as a sustainable development, not in the present necessarily, but for the future in the vocational training and education. The structure of the index, by the end of at the end of the day, the outcome of this modest work, let's say, is that it combines between two things at the same level, which are point one is the pillar or the part that studies and assess how far the vocational training and education structure or infrastructure is available in terms of the number of joiners and the graduates and the gap between those who are enrolled and those graduates and the number of males and females in this area. The other point is the job market, the labor market. How would those people graduate and how they can find jobs, decent jobs? And here we added something important. It shouldn't be just a job, but a decent job. Based on the definition of the organization. And this is a perspective that has led to eliminating a lot of changes that are of a quantum nature, not a quality. So this has made a kind of quality change, quality leap. Those jobs that require sustainability in terms of job finding, job continuity, and public policies at large. So the final structure of the education for this year combines between these two main points, but each of them integrates a lot of changes or sub points, like, for example, ongoing learning and skills upscale. There is the structure of education, like government spending and quality. So we need to guarantee that we have quality programs introduced because some countries face demographic dilemmas and issues. We cannot rely only on quantity based standards and be fair to Tunisia compared to Tunisia, fair to Egypt compared to Tunisia or to Qatar or some GCC countries. Why? Because the number of students is not relevant, is not fair. So the quality standards will be different from those of in countries where the number of students per professors or teachers as a ratio is very big. So we are talking about the demographic changes in addition to a lot of changes. Also, at the level of job market, we have created a bridge between the technical jobs skills and the labor market. So how soon and how well those graduates can enter the market and how far can these graduates continue in the job market and how fair how fair it is to provide the job, the labor market with the graduates who have all these skills technically, whether they are normal people or those of special needs or people of determination. All of these factors have been added and integrated in this index. We can see that there is a knowledge gap at the level of education as a whole and at the vocational training and education in particular. We can find that there are some gaps, as I said, in the knowledge infrastructure. This gap is the gap that today the economic development models in the world uh, substantiate this as rich countries and poor countries. So this gap is widening, and we are talking about poor countries and enabled countries if we are talking about the level of knowledge. As for the outcomes or results, there are some countries that have continued in the rest of the indexes or indicators, like the US, Germany, and Switzerland. These three countries are leaders in the vocational education and training, and they are also leaders in creating a balance between knowledge infrastructure for vocational education and training and the job market. This kind of balance has made these three countries to be top countries in the vocational education and training. At the level of the job market, we can see that the United States of America has the most balanced components of vocational education and training and the needs of the job market for those graduates. This is There is an ongoing communication between leaders in the job market and those working in the education sector in the vocational domain. This has boosted and qualified and quantified the number of graduates and the quality of their education. So this is even found in Germany in a better way than the US and Switzerland, but the index here is subject to balance between the two frameworks. Some countries at the level of vocational education were really at the top in spite of the weak job market, like Lithuania, Poland, and Germany. The job market, Germany, Czech Republic, and Bulgaria has more dynamic and positive nature of job market at the level of the Arab countries. The Arab countries, the UAE has ranked first, second the US, and then Kuwait. In terms of the international rating, the United Arab Emirates was ranked 8 internationally for the vocational education and training. At the level of the education components and the curriculum, we can find a gap in the Arab community, and this is detected in those countries that have weak education infrastructure, while we have some countries that have important education infrastructure. At the level of the components of the curriculum in the vocational education, we can find that the KSA, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, provides the most of the vocational education, and followed by the UAE and then Kuwait. At the level of the job market, if we want to make a comparison, we find that Kuwait has ranked first in providing more dynamic and convenient economic infrastructure in terms of the job market, and it ranked 10 internationally. At the end of the day, this is the ranking of all Arab countries. there is a big knowledge gap at the level of vocational education and training, and I think that the index is concerned with providing a new map and a new highlights in order to encourage countries that do need to take steps to set plans to develop the vocational education and training. Sorry for taking long, and thank you for your kind attention.
اتفضل دكتور علي.
Yes, Dr. Ali, you can start right away. There is no time to introduce. Peace be upon you. Good afternoon, everyone.
On this screen in the middle, the screen دي عليها ايه لو تعرف؟ عليها التايم، والتايم مديني 13 دقيقة يعني، فاعذروني إذا استعجلت في
I have only 13 minutes, so sorry if I speak fast. Many thanks to those who have worked hard on coming out with the higher education index. Dr. Hani, Stephanie, and Anthony, and the group of experts whom I represent. I have worked with the great professors, Professor Schneider, Professor Gonek, and others. So higher education knowledge index, I would not go into defining higher education and its social and economic or socio-economic importance, but how do we know the level of higher education in a given country? This is the question that should be raised, and we have tried to answer this question more than 6 years ago when we started building up the knowledge index in the Arab homeland, and this index has moved to international level in 2 versions. In version 1, we took an approach called entry systems or input system, where we have input, process, and output. It was very difficult to work on the changes and to measure all these processes. So in version 2, we skipped this, and in the third version, I have been very happy to have more promising results, and higher education knowledge index is an attempt where we can diagnose the current status of a given country against the dimensions and themes of the index, and identifying the areas that need to be paid attention for by researchers and decision makers. This index gives a general overview about higher education in each country, and with this contradicts the classification or the rating of university, those who take care of rating and not the sector as a whole. This index can follow up with the progress achieved in each country. The index review has started. The higher education index review has started with a kind of critical examination of the 2017 index, with recognition of the limited capabilities in introducing a comprehensive list of changes. There are some challenges and limitations that caused obstacles to come up with a really different index. We have reduced the number of changes and the main themes and sub-themes, in addition to the data we have at hand. Sometimes we would like to add something, but we don't have enough data to support those points. The changes that have been made on the 2017 Higher Education Index, first of all, The higher education index takes into account all levels of higher education. In the previous versions, it started with the high school or with the baccalaureate, but it might be like institutional education, vocational training for 2 years, not necessarily a degree, college or university. It might be 2 years, something like that, and then we have the bachelor's degree, master's degree, PhD, or what is relevant. As I have said as well before lunch, if you remember, we have talked about the inputs and outputs or outcomes. Here in this version, we have added a very important dimension, a pillar important in the learning environment. And you will see how we have defined the learning or higher education learning environment. So these pillars and the outcomes of the higher education have been added as a third pillar that was dedicated to higher education environment. Because here we have sustainability and we have research. So experts disagree that we might not have an accurate evaluation or rating. We might have a lot of universities in some countries that are wrongly rated locally, and this is different internationally. A lot of changes have been added about fairness in higher education and academic freedom and holistic and diversity in higher education. So we have defined higher education as an education characterized by academic freedom, whether professors discuss topics fearlessly and publish fearlessly, and it is also just. It is characterized by justice, and it gives the opportunity. This means that it gives the opportunity to all students, regardless of gender, race, or socioeconomic backgrounds, place. So this is open to everyone, and there are diversity, and we have males, females, even professors can be males and females. So the ratios uh, are quite fair in the academic staff. We have also focused on the qualifications of the students, and we have added the impact of universities, and this is something quite good, where we have an economic impact and something related to research. So we have three main pillars, and we have higher education inputs, joining, expenditure and resources, and then we have the learning environment pillar, and this measures the higher education justice, freedom, and inclusiveness. And the last one, we have the outcomes or the outputs, which contains again three sub pillars, where we have the graduates, labor market, and the upscale of skills. Here in the middle, you can see the big addition in gray, which is different from the previous versions, in addition to adding changes in a wonderful way through discussions and constructive discussion among all participants. This is the rating of the countries internationally. Switzerland ranked first, followed by it earned 71.3. So we are not saying that it is number one 100%. So there are still some opportunities for improvement. That's why we give a percentage that is logical. This is part of the profile of Switzerland. So if we take a look here at the higher education side, and which is Number three from the left, we have here three pillars: inputs, learning environment, and outputs. How wonderful it is that we have the learning outputs maximized, and maybe you have inputs that are far less than outputs. It's wrong to have inputs that are much more than outputs. So what has distinguished Switzerland is that it has more outputs than inputs. So it has maximized its outputs. The United Arab Emirates, here we have, it is ranking 16 internationally. So what happened here, if you take a look at the United Arab Emirates, the distinctive characteristic is maximizing inputs. Again, maximizing inputs is the feature or the distinctive characteristic. So maximizing inputs is very important for any country that wants to be distinguished, not just in higher education sector, but in every sector related to education. Thank you for your time and kind attention, and I'm ready to take any questions with the panel. Thank you so much, dear speakers, and I would like to pay the audience's attention. These indexes or indicators rely on the approach or system done by experts. So we might have different results and outcomes by different experts and different approaches. Another point is that I'd like to highlight is that while you are looking at these results and figures in the index, you might think that there are other inputs and things that can be added. This is correct and this is true. We have went through all indexes and indicators in all sectors, but we have seen that there are some circumstances or some conditions that prevent us from adding something. So there was something about quality of air inside the classes, and some people suggested that this is an important point to add, but we have found that only 20 to 25 countries that have data for this input. So we skipped it. So the number of the countries inside each index or indicator was a determinant whether we take this or leave it. Sometimes we would replace some indicator by another one that is so close. So now we will open the way for your questions. If you have any questions, or peace be upon you, Dr. Hazelmani. I am a specialist in knowledge economy. I would like to thank you for the progress made in this index. I know the previous versions, and there is remarkable progress, and it is really efficient and effective and important for countries. Actually, I have a question. First of all, in case there is no information, information are not available, do we put zero or we add a similar value to all countries? So this is the first part of my question. The second part is, in spite of the sub-pillars and their importance, in higher education or general education, there might be uh, some some people, some students leaving education, and they don't complete their education, so they join and just don't graduate or don't continue. They continue in another way. So in higher education, how do you deal with this if we are talking about maximizing outputs. How can we do that? I'll answer your first part of the question in terms of, because it's my area of specialty. If there is a missing value, we'll keep it as missing value, and we will not replace the number with another number. And there are many ways and many indicators where we can add the average, let's say, specific to a given country. For example, Kuwait had some missing changes in the sector of education. When we looked at this, how can we compensate for these numbers through the human resources index? We know that Kuwait is on top of the indexes in terms of human development, but in terms of education, it is very weak and at very low ranking. So if we want to put Kuwait in those countries that are of high rating, this would be unfair. This is just to reassure you that after the summit, we will study the importance of the introduction of artificial intelligence to compensate for the lost values within an index, because we have found out that reliance on one aspect or one dimension in index would make us lose a lot of areas. So it is fair uh, to give these countries a minimum rating instead of giving zero. Nobody will take zero, of course. Zero will affect the final percentage. We might add not available in A, or we will do kind of normalization and collect all these changes, because this would create harm to all countries. As for the second part of your question, if some students quit learning, quit higher education, and don't complete their degrees or majors. For example, a country like Egypt, where they rely more on vocational economy, let's say, with a big number of population. So uh, people exiting the higher education sector to the vocational sector or to the job market might be more efficient. So Jordan or Tunisia, we find that the total of the higher education graduates is higher and bigger. So the nature of the academia and the economy might be different. So it's important to take that into account. So what about positive, let's say, positive drop, or people who leave universities to for something different or positive? Don't forget that in higher education, the index itself is called composite, which is composite of different sectors. So if some people quit higher education or drop university, so and go to vocational education and training, this is calculated as part of the vocational sector, and this is taken into account when we do the measurements and assessment of these countries. So we don't measure this only with the conclusion of a specific country. We measure the percentage in terms of the number of population from 25 years and above, and this takes into consideration the drop or the quitting of students from university. I understand this from the index that doctor said. Sometimes the statistics don't take this into account. Um, so we 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 want to focus on public education in particular. I have a research in knowledge economy. My research says that we have to make a radical change between knowledge economy and the job market. We have stereotyped this mechanism, so I'm afraid that we might have a drop or quit in a positive way, but this is good for economy but bad for education. So even if we have people who drop university or quit education, this is monitored in all sectors. So we have the economy sector inside, which is part of the economy, and public education is also measured. So what I want to communicate to you is that you might find things that you feel are negative, but we have things that to make balance more than being totally positive. So everything will be taken into account. So balance is a characteristic of the index. So this is done on 6, 7 sectors together. So it might be negative in some area, but it would be positive reflected in another one. And I consider it was one of the most important. Thank you so much for the remark. So I would like to highlight the idea that we don't want to have a high increase in the percentage of people dropping education or uh, higher education, and we can say that people quitting or dropping education has positive or negative area. So I would like to have people those who are interested in accessing vocational education and training, they would do that from the beginning. So if this is mentioned in the index, it is of negative effect and impact in all ways. I can add something here. Some people in the US, for example, might start college or university. 60% would complete their studies, but 40% for some family or financial reasons would not complete their studies, would drop or quit. So the index measures and assess the employment rate. So even if there is a negative, let's say, nature of this when they quit or drop, but this is calculated positively as part of the job market or the labor market. Especially the mechanism of selection and even the curricula available. We have some curricula that are not related to the economic so we don't have a geography or a job for geography. So this is a nature found in all Arabic economies. So connecting higher education or university education with jobs, some people would come to you and say, I want to specialize in philosophy. I want to be a philosopher. So the human capital theory, there should be capacity in front of all joiners who would specialize in their interest first and what would serve economy and development and job market second. We don't want to do them wrong in terms of choosing their measures. Any other questions?
To found an index for the indication for the education in order to this index to evaluate the educational system, the effective index that for the provided for the available information that when we talk about perceptions of some Arab countries, Tunisia or Morocco, and 70% of their kids that they are not gaining the best quality of education. So many families, many parents are not well qualified to evaluate their kids' education. But we have to move to the next step. Actually, on the Arab region, especially particularly in the Arab region, that we have to, in general, to evaluate the Arabic education in the Arab region. So but individually, we can also do country by country an evaluation system to find out the accurate index to evaluate the accurate education in the Arab countries.
والبيانات المتوفرة وشكرا
شكرا
جزيلا.
لحضرتك.
Thank you very much. In fact, that we implement that in 2010, we did on the standards of Arab countries that, and it was very effective evaluation. In 2010, we did some evaluation test and how we tested their ability, how to communication. And I think this kind of study that it needs a very logistic support, and it needs a very big logistic support. It's not an easy method to go around country by country, and this project has not only turned for 2 terms and 4 courses. Now we end and we finalize this course, and we are going to have the second session, the second session